The Battle of Mohács, the fall of the medieval Kingdom of Hungary. Mohács is a small town near the border of the Danube River, about 200 kilometers from Budapest. For Hungarians, however, the name of the town is more than a geographical location. It's a symbol of defeat, collapse, and destruction. It is where, in the summer of 1526, King Louis II's army suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Suleiman I, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The old Hungarian adage of "more was lost at Mohács" is still used to offer consolation in the face of adversity. But what exactly was at stake at Mohács? What happened during that battle, and what were the reasons for that devastating defeat? Hungary under the Jagiellonian kings. King Matyás died in 1490, and following this, the Polish-Lithuanian Jagiellonian dynasty ruled Hungary until 1526. Despite a span of 3.5 decades that were bathed in a glow of prosperity and Renaissance culture, internal social and political tensions increased, and the threat of an Ottoman invasion loomed ever darker on the horizon. It was during this period that the Archbishop of Esztergom, Tamás Bakóc, oversaw the construction of a magnificent chapel. Bearing his name, it is the only surviving Renaissance structure in Hungary that remains intact. Many significant winged altarpieces were made, and the works of the great painter known by the initials MS were comparable to those of the greatest German masters. However, internal strife across the country was growing, as evidenced by the Peasant Rebellion of 1514. Throughout medieval Europe, peasants who resented social differences and sought greater equality occasionally rebelled against their landlords. But this was no ordinary rebellion. It all began in the spring of 1514, when Archbishop Bakóc declared a crusade against the Ottomans, offering apostolic pardon to all who participated. He entrusted the army to György Dózsa, a Transylvanian lieutenant with experience in fighting the Turks. Peasants, craftsmen, students, and priests flocked to his camp, but tensions arose when landlords refused to allow their serfs to join, deeming it necessary for them to continue working in the fields. Anger flared among the 40,000 crusaders, and atrocities and even a minor skirmish took place, leading Bakóc to call off the military campaign. However, this only added fuel to the fire. The crusaders were outraged that they'd been disbanded without completing their mission. They ransacked nobles' manors, raped women, and murdered and pillaged wherever they went. The main army, led by Dózsa, defeated the forces of the nobility at Nagylak, and the rebels impaled the captured nobles, including the Bishop of Csanád. The uprising turned into an all-out war, with fighting raging in several parts of the country. Eventually, Dózsa was defeated at Temesvár by the Transylvanian voivode János Szapolyai's army. The nobility's revenge was gruesome. Burning iron tongs were used to rip pieces of Dózsa's flesh from his body, while his officers were forced to eat them. Cruel as it was, this punishment was far from unprecedented in Europe at that time. On the other hand, thousands of the serfs involved were spared, and although the Parliament of 1514 banned the free movement of serfs, except for those peasants who were loyal to their lords, the provision was never enforced and was abolished a few years later. During the same parliamentary session, the protonotary István Verbőci presented his collection of laws in a work known as the Tripartitum. It outlined the privileges of the nobility, including their exemption from taxation, their right to personal freedom, and their right to resistance. It also outlined the doctrine of the Holy Crown. At the heart of this doctrine lies the principle of the division of power. The Holy Crown symbolizes the power of the state, The state is defined as meaning the king and the nation. Here, the nation refers primarily to the nobility. Thus, the king exercises power not by his own right, but by the right of the crown. While the collection of laws known as the Tripartitum was adopted by Parliament, it never became legally binding. Nevertheless, it remained the basis of Hungarian law for 300 years. Hungary between two great powers. In the 15th century, the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire reached the borders of Hungary. At the time, Hungary was an important and wealthy European kingdom that had been a major player in international politics for centuries. It was widely regarded throughout Europe as the bastion of Christianity that stood in the way of Islamic conquest. In the past, the Hungarians had succeeded in repelling the attacks of the Ottomans and built formidable fortifications on the southern border. However, by the early 16th century, the balance of power had shifted. The Ottoman Empire had grown vast in size, having conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. It now dominated the eastern Mediterranean, with land stretching from the Hungarian border all the way to modern-day Iran. In 1520, Suleiman, later known as Suleiman the Magnificent, ascended to the throne, determined to continue his predecessor's conquests. His objective was to expand his empire to the west, particularly by defeating the Habsburg Empire. His path led right through the Kingdom of Hungary. The Habsburg dynasty expanded its territories primarily through marriage, not war. At the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries, in addition to the Austrian provinces, they had acquired such wealthy regions as Burgundy, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Spain, and southern Italy. A year before Suleiman ascended to the throne, Charles V was elected Holy Roman Emperor, and during his reign, the Habsburg Empire would become a world power. Meanwhile, Charles's younger brother Ferdinand would lay claim to the Hungarian throne. By the beginning of the 16th century, Hungary had become trapped between these two expansionist powers. After Mátyás's death, the King of Bohemia, Vladislav II, who hailed from the Jagiellonian family, was elected King of Hungary by the Hungarian estates. His election took place on two conditions. The first was that Vladislav would combine the resources of his kingdoms to defend against the Ottomans. The second was that he should cut back on the taxes imposed during Mátyás's reign. Vladislav II complied with the second demand, and state revenues dwindled to between 1/2 to 1/3 of those during Mátyás's time. This, in turn, made it increasingly difficult to meet the first condition. The lack of funding meant that the state could no longer afford to properly maintain the costly border fortifications, nor could it pay for its soldiers' equipment, food, and wages. The mercenaries of Mátyás's famed Black Army turned to looting after the state failed to pay them, and had to be defeated by none other than Mátyás's legendary commander, Pál Kinizsi. The situation was exacerbated by internal divisions and factionalism, which the new king Louis II, crowned in 1516 at the age of just 10, was unable to control. As a result, Hungary's defenses were dramatically weakened, just as its greatest challenge lay ahead. Preparing for battle. Suleiman's first move was to disrupt Hungary's southern line of border fortifications. In 1521, the Ottoman army captured the fortresses of Sobacs and Zimogy. However, the greatest loss for Hungary was the fall of its most strategically located fortress, considered the key to Hungary, at Nándorfehérvár, present-day Belgrade. It had been there, in 1456, that János Hunyadi's armies, with the help of the Crusaders, achieved a world-renowned victory. However, By 1521, only 700 Hungarian and Serbian soldiers were there to face off against the Sultan's army of 30,000. Despite having no artillery, they resisted the Ottoman onslaught for 66 days. By the time the castle was taken on the 29th of August, only 72 soldiers were left alive. And so, the key to Hungary was now in the hands of Suleiman. The Ottomans spent the following years preparing for their invasion of Hungary while engaging in a number of minor skirmishes. Leading the defense of Lower Hungary was the hussar-turned-monk Chief Captain Pál Tomori. At the Pope's urging, he eventually accepted the Archbishopric of Kolochá and used the income to reorganize the country's defenses. He was described by his contemporaries as straightforward and honest, and one who understood the machinations of the Turks far better than the intrigues of the court. Even as Archbishop, he insisted on wearing the monastic gown. With several thousand troops at his command, Tomori caused the Turks significant setbacks, but struggled to pay his soldiers, at one point even being forced to sell salt to the enemy in order to raise funds. In 1526, a now 20-year-old Louis II was old enough to understand the gravity of his responsibilities. Some sources portray him as a reckless and indulgent youth who spent his time with ladies-in-waiting, even dressing as a devil on the last night of the carnival season. However, other sources describe him as a generous, pious, and good-natured young man, whose initial irresponsibility was simply down to inexperience. Nevertheless, when he heard of Suleiman's military preparations in the spring of 1526, he took action. On the 24th of April, he convened Parliament on Rákos Field near Pest to come up with defensive measures. He wrote to the Christian rulers of Europe, including King Henry VIII of England, King Francis I of France, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and his own relative, the King of Poland, to ask for their help in defending Christian Hungary against the pagan conquerors. The Pope provided funding for mercenaries and allowed him to sell some of the Hungarian church's treasures. Parliament also approved the necessary measures and ordered the army to assemble in Tolna on the 2nd of July. However, no troops showed up on the appointed date. This was due to the Hungarian military structure at the time, which was based on a unit called the Banderium. Most Hungarians were not professional soldiers, and when the king called his subjects to arms, they would gather under the banners of the lords, prelates, and counties. However, during harvest season, funds and men available for warfare were both in short supply. Thus, on the 20th of July, the king set out from Buda with only 4,000 men, hoping that the expected troops would join him on the way. All the while, the Ottomans were already besieging Petervárad at the border, where the self-sacrifice of the defenders meant a 2-week reprieve. However, the king was to make a fatal mistake. He sent a series of conflicting orders to János Szapolyai, the Transylvanian voivode who was stationed at Torda defending Transylvania. He first requested he join the army against the Turks, then to stay in Transylvania, and finally to join him after all. Szapolyai replied, asking which of the contradictory orders he should obey. The Battle of Mohács. Louis II reached Mohács at the end of August. Although it was unnecessary for him to rush ahead, he wished to demonstrate his determination before the lords who did not want to go to war without him. The king's troops numbered around 25,000, which, by European standards of the time, was a considerable force. If they'd had another 2 weeks, the size of the army could have grown even larger, since George of Brandenburg was approaching Győr heading up 10,000 German and Czech troops. Krzysztof Frangipan had already reached Zagreb, and János Szapolyai's 10,000-strong Transylvanian contingent was marching from Torda to link up with the main army. The king appointed Pál Tomori to command the royal army. Tomori estimated the size of the Ottoman host at 300,000, but in reality, with its 70,000 men, it was about 3 times larger than the Hungarian army. In the days before the battle, the Hungarians were confident of victory, and many demanded that the king give battle as soon as possible. However, there were some, like Bishop Ferenc Perényi, who had a strong sense of impending doom, saying, "You will see, Your Majesty, the day we attack will be the day of 20,000 Christian martyrs." The precise details of the battle, including its exact location and the reasons for Hungary's defeat, remain a subject of debate among historians. What is known is that early in the morning of the 29th of August, the Hungarian army formed up for battle, although there was no sign of the enemy for quite some time. The cavalry was positioned on either flank, with infantry and artillery in between. Commander-in-Chief Tomori led the first line, while the king took up his position in the center of the second line, together with the prelates and barons. They remained in battle formation for most of the day, clad in armor under the blazing sun. Around 3 p.m., some of the nobles recommended that the army should return to camp. Upon finding out, Tomori rushed to the king and urged him to attack right away, arguing that the battle must not be postponed on any account, and that it was less risky to face a portion of the enemy's troops now than the entire army the next day. Thus, the king gave the order to attack, his face turning pale as he put on his helmet, according to one eyewitness account. The ensuing battle would last less than 2 hours. During the first 30 minutes, the Hungarians appeared to gain the upper hand. The charge of the cavalry on the right wing surprised the Ottomans' Rumelian contingent as it was preparing to set up camp. Seeing this, the infantry in the center, led by the king, also pressed forward. However, the cavalry on the right wing now found itself within firing range of the Janissaries, whose volleys tore through their ranks. At the same time, the cavalry on the left wing was ground down by the Ottomans' Anatolian contingent, who greatly outnumbered them. With both wings collapsing, the infantry in the center was surrounded by the Ottomans. As the Hungarian battle line completely disintegrated, there would be no orderly retreat. Instead, the rout turned into a brutal massacre. The consequences. August the 29th, 1526, did indeed become the day of 20,000 Christian martyrs. The Hungarian army was annihilated. Among the casualties were the commander, Archbishop Pál Tomori of Kolocsa, the Archbishop of Esztergom, 5 bishops, including Ferenc Perényi, and more than 30 barons. The Ottomans continued the slaughter even after the battle had ceased, executing thousands of prisoners. If the account of one of his companions is to be believed, King Louis II drowned in the Cele stream during a sudden August downpour as he fled the battlefield. The credibility of this account was questioned even by contemporaries, owing to the stream's small size and the lack of other witnesses. Nevertheless, no other plausible explanations have surfaced since, and even the shallow water could have proved deadly to the king if he fell from his horse wearing heavy armor. The death of King Louis II was more than a personal tragedy. Following their victory at Mohács, Suleiman's troops marched to Buda, where they pillaged and looted the defenseless city and palace for a month and a half before withdrawing from Hungary. After the death of the king, the country became embroiled in a fight for the throne, and a civil war ensued. János Szapolyai, the voivode of Transylvania, was elected king by an initial meeting of parliament. However, just a few weeks later, a subsequent parliamentary meeting elevated Ferdinand Habsburg to the throne instead. Decades of struggle between the two rival kings would ensue, during which Szapolyai sought out the support of Sultan Suleiman. But the Sultan's embrace proved to be fatal. In 1541, when Ferdinand's troops laid siege to Buda, the men of the Szapolyai party, with the help of Turkish auxiliaries, successfully defended the city, driving Ferdinand's men out. It was precisely at this time that Suleiman's army arrived. On the 29th of August, just as the widowed Queen Isabella and her child were visiting Suleiman's tent beneath the castle walls, Turkish soldiers who initially arrived at Buda Castle as tourists went to admire the sights of the royal seat. More and more of them appeared, swarming the streets until they went from being tourists to soldiers, disarming the guards and taking the castle. From this point forward, the country was divided into three parts. The western part, controlled by the Habsburgs, the Transylvanian territories in the east, and the central region, which was annexed by the Ottoman Empire. The latter would remain under Turkish rule for the next 145 years. The loss of the Battle of Mohács in 1526 meant the end of Hungary's independence, maintained for more than 500 years prior. Whilst the defeat could have been avoided under more fortunate circumstances, the blame does not lie with poor military leadership, a weak king, or a lack of political unity. Rather, it can be attributed to the huge difference in resources between the Kingdom of Hungary and the neighboring great powers, the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. As it is, the Battle of Mohács and the fall of the Kingdom of Hungary proved to have major significance for the continent as a whole. For the first time in centuries, Islamic conquerors were once again approaching the heart of Europe.